G'day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the Matter Mentality podcast, where we talk all things science, psychology, performance, nutrition, physiology to help you optimize and be at your best. Now, this episode, we are joined by a very special, I would say unique guest that probably would be a little bit left field of what you might expect on this channel. But given my realms of study, education, interests, fixations, obsessions, the once we get into this conversation, you will probably understand a bit more as to why he's here, because it definitely fits a certain part of the bill. But we are joined by George at Tinmen.
That's me.
That'll
Hi.
do. We'll go with that.
Hi.
How are you, mate?
Oh yeah, I'm good, thank you. Very different time for me than it is for you. So, but we're both drinking coffee, it seems. So
Yeah, so 7 p.m. for me. I've still got a lot of work to do, and it's 8 a.m. for you.
oh, yeah, nine.
9.
Thank
Okay.
goodness.
A little bit later in the morning for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess to get started. So for those who don't know, Tin Man is a very confrontational, awareness, educational men's health page, I guess you could kind of describe it as, on Instagram. But it has definitely taken on kind of like I guess you say, like a life of its own, in terms of where we turn for that research or that education, that information, some support. The comments and stuff I've read on your page is literally just people coming for just to be there and say good day, or read the stuff and say how it's helped. But yeah, I guess if you could give us a bit of a what is Tin Man? What is the page? What are we trying to achieve there? Because there's a lot to unravel there.
I mean, it's a lot of different things. I guess for me, it's about filling in a lot of the gaps in what I saw in the conversation around gender equality. Focusing on men and boys, all around the world. But I suppose for me, the common denominator is mental health. I know there's a lot of advocacy around mental health and how that ties into physical health. But I've always found advocacy to be useful, but also limited. Like,
Yep.
I know when we talk about men's mental health and male suicide, we normally get the same slogans around encouraging men to cry or boys to talk, which is a very, very worthwhile thing and something that I support too. But I try to explore the reasons why men may not be able to cry or may not be able to talk, and look at the structural issues that are causing their distress. And a lot of that is around difficulty in childhood or education or fatherlessness or domestic violence. And I try to widen the scope of mental health to look at what is causing the problem itself. I always find that crying is good and a worthy thing, but it's more of a means of dealing with the problem rather than a solution to the problem itself. The problem is what is causing that distress.
Yes.
And there's a myriad of unspoken about issues that I want to talk about, and I try to do so in a way difficult. I mean, if you're interested in the creative strategy behind it all, but trying to find out the best way of having those conversations that are, on one side, inclusive and welcoming and friendly, but at the same time unapologetic and, to use your word, confrontational. How do we bring those two sides together, and how do we have that conversation on Instagram in 10 slides? So it's a challenge, but the good thing is that so few people are talking about these things that it leaves me with a huge wealth of things I can talk about and write about that no one's covering, because they are somehow, for some reason, controversial. So it's good for me because it means that it's like the forbidden fruit. No one wants to eat it, but I'm there gobbling it all down. And
This is all for me.
and it's like, oh, delicious. And it's just a
Thanks
day
for
of
the engagement,
reckoning, no
guys.
doubt. Yeah, well, I mean, it's good for me. I mean, it's like it's people think I'm some sort of expert, and I suppose comparatively speaking, I am. But it's sad that just some random guy on Instagram who's a Bachelor of Arts and a filmmaker can somehow become an expert in these issues. I mean, I always say it shouldn't be me doing this, but it is. It should be our politicians. It should be our doctors and our researchers, our educators and policymakers, healthcare professionals. Not me, but I'm the best you've got for now. So good to meet you.
it's a what's the word? The value to it and the honor, I guess, that comes from it somewhat. Like, there is a degree of appreciation that men, I'm sure, express to you personally, and probably try and get across, because it is so necessary, and it is something, like you said, it is something that's lacking, it's something that isn't there, that we can't really turn to. And that's kind of why I think this chat's so important, is that we're going to explore a few things across, like you said, the way that psychological health, mental health associate to physical health, and the data is quite clear, when we look at exercise psychology, the amount of men with muscle dysmorphia and body image issues is actually higher than females, but it's a very almost taboo topic to mention. Like, oh, there's no way men have these problems. Well, why do you think there are 10,000 guys in the gym trying to look like Arnie? It's not all because they look like Arnie. They're not all competitive in nature. It's just that is a thing that exists. And like you said, for that alone to exist is for you to exist for that, reasons like that, let alone the myriad of other reasons, is definitely important. But I get, like, the big thing for me is how you go with, well, the big thing for me, one of the big things for me, because there's gonna be a lot of big things. One of the big things for me is how you go with the challenge of conversation, like the fact that we're purely going to refer to you as George because there is some privacy issues we wish to keep in order to allow you to sustain A, Tinmen, but B, your life outside of it, because there are, challenges, threats, direct attacks, the virtue woke signaling that may come across from it. There's a lot to it that just simply like trying to keep privacy is almost necessary for your livelihood.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should preface this by saying I've not got bricks sailing through my living room window, or no one's leaving like bags of dog shit on my doorstep. But there have been, obviously there is pushback to this. I mean, it's not just me. I'm doing this as a consequence of the experience of people before me. I mean, I have a podcast as well. My first guest was someone called Erin Pitsey. And Erin Pitsey was the woman who 50 years ago opened the first refuge in the world for abused women, only a few miles away from my house. Wow. So she saw, before that, domestic violence was seen as a behind closed doors, private family matter. And she was like, no, this is a serious epidemic of violence against women. We need to get these women out of these houses. And there's nowhere for them to go. So Erin started basically squatting in abandoned houses all over London and bringing the women in and the children in. And she became the biggest squatter in the country. She took over whole streets and hotels and saved the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of women. This is 50 years ago, the first ever refuge in the world. And then one of the things she found very early on is that a lot of the women that were coming to her were also violent themselves. So she discovered what was essentially a cycle of violence, where women and men were living in violent relationships of reciprocal violence, and they were both contributing. And the solution was getting them both out of the house. So she immediately saw domestic violence as not a gendered issue, and she wanted to open a refuge for men too. And as soon as she started to say things along those lines, despite being based on her personal experience, she was subjected to serious harassment, threats. She had like bomb squads going through her mail. She had the police escort around the country. And eventually she did actually leave the country and was usurped from her charity. And that's only one of many stories, similar stories that are sadly, where if you seem to talk about men, especially in areas of like domestic violence and sexual abuse, if you try to talk about men, often you will receive pushback from a very small but loud minority of idiots. And I tried to make the fundamental principle of me and my page about nothing I say excludes women. I'm not trying to overwrite men on top of women. I'm trying to expand the conversation, add a second side to the story, because often these issues are causal of each other. Domestic violence being a great example, is that you can't solve violence against women unless you also solve violence against men. So by solving violence against men, I am indirectly solving or helping solve violence against women. That's the thing I need to keep bringing myself back to. Like, everything people believe and feel about women, I also feel. My heart breaks for women too, but I'm adding to that conversation. I'm really not trying to take away from it. So yeah, I mean, yeah, but point is, yeah, I've not had any. I've had a few stupid messages. I've had a few threats, and they're all just silly. I don't consider myself in danger. I've had a few people say, "Oh, the Tinmen, they get death threats and this and that," and I'm just like, just simmer down. Like, it's really not that bad. I know people that have had those situations, have literally had windows smashed and cars keyed and stuff like that. But I think I like to think that because I communicate in a way that's a bit more welcoming, a
Mhm.
little less conflict orientated, I have not, as of yet, been on the receiving end of anything I would consider problematic threats. So I don't want people to start to worry about me. But it would also be silly of me not to protect a little bit of my personal identity.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh, I don't. I mean, I've never shared any of my content on my personal Instagram page, for example. I don't follow my. I don't even follow my own page. Uh, so there's certain elements of this common sense that I do, but at the same time, I'm not, jumping for cover every day. I'm
Oh,
not
of
getting into
course not.
fights in a local park. So
But I mean,
it's
even if we look at like the current, I guess, social climate that there are these risks or potential backlash or kickback. I've been involved in Facebook conversations where, and it got to a point where it became humorous for me, where I couldn't even bring up topics of conversation, either health related, psychology related, nutrition related, where the person or the group perhaps that I was engaging with would hunt down my personal employer, try and find my business
yeah,
page, or try and find a certain place that I engage in or work to refute me or deny me,
yeah,
or, and that's just me at my level of just simply stirring conversation for the fact that it needs to exist. At the level where you've got tens of thousands of people listening on your every word, let's say that for every 1,000 people with 2 degrees of separation, there's a million people. Let's look at
yeah,
40,000 people. It doesn't take
mm,
much for someone there to be connected to, say, a very hardcore left-leaning person that is all about like, no, you've got to shut up. That
yeah,
that degree of fear is still somewhat present, that this could
yeah.
turn back on my personal life, and not so much physical violence, but there is the ramifications of potentially your personal life being affected by the fact that you just care.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking about this yesterday with some friends of mine. A lot of the information I present doesn't just go against common perceptions of different problems. It often goes against someone's fundamental identity as a human being.
Mhm.
Using domestic violence as a great example, is a lot of people are based their fundamental identity, politically speaking, on domestic violence being a gendered issue
Mhm.
caused by patriarchal need for power and control. And
Mhm.
people are like they've built their life around it. They've built their friendship groups around it. Some
Mhm.
people's job is dependent on it. They've got the T-shirt, they've got the
Yep.
badge. Every their family, the community, everything's built around that remaining fundamentally true. And if I present data, huge amounts of data that
Mhm.
said actually domestic violence isn't gendered,
Yep.
and it isn't just down to the need for power and control. And when it
Mhm.
is, that need is also shown by women just as much as men.
Mhm.
That doesn't just go against what they believe, but it also goes against who they are. So it seems like an existential threat to who they are and their fundamental identity. And a lot of people don't like that. And I totally understand that. If you've badged yourself with these beliefs for
Mhm.
your essentially your entire adult life, and then someone comes along and presents compelling data that shows that actually you're wrong or you're not completely right,
Mhm.
I can see that's a threat to them. I've always described it a bit like walking around all day with food stuck between your teeth, where
Yeah.
you've been it's embarrassing, and
Yes.
you can when someone points it out, you can react angrily.
Yes.
But the question is, what do you do next? Do you keep walking around if it's stuck between your teeth, or do you go to the mirror and sort it out? So I do sympathize with people, and I do understand. I try to be sympathetic on all sides. I try when I what my approach to male violence, for example, is rather than dealing with violent men as an end product, try to ask why did they become violent? What has a
Yes.
man experienced in his life, childhood especially,
Yes.
bullying,
Mhm.
child abuse.
Mhm.
I was reading yesterday about an amazing paper about corporal punishment against children, spanking basically, and how how spanking a child is directly linked to that child more often becoming violent later in life. So I try to encourage people to explore the journey men and boys have been on to make them become who they are.
Mhm.
And it's similarly when I hear someone like a radical saying, I hate men or kill all men or whatever, I also try to apply that to them. I'm like, well, what have they experienced? Like
Yeah.
what journey have they been on? Have they've probably been through a series of very painful, traumatic experiences at the hands of men or boys. And I want to start from the same starting point of compassion by saying that whatever happened to you should never have happened. And I'm
Yes.
sorry it did. But if there's any way you can give men a second chance, I'd love to talk to you. So trying to not see people as end products, rather the consequence of their personal journey, I think is another useful philosophy that I try to use.
That in and of itself is something that should be, cross field, cross realm. Like when we look at, say, like, to make this more, I guess, direct to listeners, usually follow me from, like, say, my training or nutritional content. When we see these camps of people, like I will often put out a lot of confrontational or a lot of like conflict or challenging or direct nutritional education, physiology, psychology education. Like, I will generally challenge someone's idea. My biggest philosophy is always attack the idea, not the person, because I don't believe the person is wrong. I just believe they've been misguided and they themselves have got to a conclusion that they haven't been presented the full story or the understanding of the evidence. Now, the issue with, say, your fitness or even sales, marketing, things like that in general, is it's all about polarization. It's all about entrenchment, encampment, and how to maximize who you can bring into your camp to get you the most bang for your buck, the most revenue, the most generated interest, the most engagement, all that jazz. So when you go against that, just simply want to present something with no agenda other than I just want to correct what's wrong and put the people who are perhaps, part of the reason that it's wrong and still being spread on a bit of blast. Like, I'm putting the spotlight on you for what you're saying being wrong. I'm not saying that you're an idiot. I'm not saying that you're dangerous. I'm saying that things you're saying are dangerous. And the issue I find in modern social engagement and debate is that it's becoming almost impossible for people to separate the artist from the art. And you can't. Almost like if I'm questioning your decision to, like, your opinion on a certain aspect of men's health, if I'm challenging you on a certain aspect of nutritional belief that, keto is the way to solve everything, or low carb is the absolute answer, or, this diet is the absolute bee's knees and we've got to all be paleo. If I'm challenging you on your idea, I'm not saying you as a person are a POS. I'm not saying that you're an ass that you've got to be, let's get rid of you. I'm saying that, you've got an idea. You've absolutely entrenched your entire life around this discussion point, this topic, this idea that you think is true. I want to know how you got there and discuss these ideas, because there's a chance, as Jordan Peterson talks about, let's take on the idea that the person you're talking to may know something that you don't, and that gives you a chance to learn. If you can apply that to everyone, okay, I'm opening this discussion for you to potentially teach me. Now, if you instantly go to attack me personally, or you're going to attack me in a defensive manner, I've already come to the conclusion that there's no point engaging this, because you're either you don't know what you're talking about, or you're getting defensively and taking it personally because I'm discussing or challenging your ideological position. And I find that almost across realms, as you were talking about, like, the way it becomes like their entire identity about a fixed point or the polarization of a singular topic. And it's interesting to me how we've got to that level of debate or discussion that, we can create echo chambers. We can create these environments we exist in where everyone just tells you you're right and nothing else can be possibly wrong. How you view the world, that is absolutely how it is. And then the second, it's almost like an invader comes in and says, hey, you know what? That's actually not true. And they're just like, holy shit, they're trying to conquer us all, make these people suffer. Reality is, I'm just saying, hey, you might be a little bit wrong here. Let's talk about it. And I just find it so interesting the way just simply challenging someone's belief or opinion or idea, which should be, to me, the basis or premise of ideological debate, discussion, philosophy, is almost like literally putting a gun to their head and saying, that's it, you're done. It blows my mind that we've got to that point.
Well, it's a really interesting point, Ben, in terms of we do both exist in similar, quite dogmatic spaces. Like, my mum's a nutritionist, like a doctor in nutrition, and she works for the NHS, and she specializes in obesity. And she is a very simple, no nonsense approach to nutrition. I'd always go to her with these obscene things. Mum, what do I do for carbs? What do I do with this? Should I eat fat? Should I not eat fat? She's like, everything in moderation, George. That was her advice continually for about 30 years. And I was like, there's got to be more to it. And she's like, everything in moderation. I'm like, what about apples? And she's like, how many? You eating 10 a day or 1 a day? Or what about chocolate? How many? You eat chocolate, eat fat, eat whatever you want, just don't eat too much. And I think there's a big part of my voice is my mum's voice. Very, very no nonsense, matter of fact. So it's a very interesting parallel you've drawn there between nutrition and what I talk about. And there's the dogmatic beliefs between the two. And how again, similarly, if you're confronting someone about their approach to nutrition, often you're not just approaching them as being wrong, but you're also essentially eroding their livelihood. If they've built a career or business around this thing being true, and you're saying that's actually not true or not entirely true, I can understand why they would be defensive, and it makes a lot of sense. So it's a very interesting parallel to draw on. I hadn't really considered that. I got a lot of I have a weird amount of personal trainers and nutritionists and vegans, following me. And
Yeah,
it's
right.
like I guess it's maybe we're living parallel lives, and I think we're sympathetic of each other.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that as some of your demographic, but I can see I can see why. Like if we look, even like, to not go straight into to health straight away, but generally even amongst the men that I work with, and myself being a man that does what I do in the realm that I work in, we we have a lot of mental health issues. A lot of my coaching, a
Oh
lot of
yeah.
my training, a lot of my programming, it's the programming and education side around that aspect is a piece of piss. The hard stuff to me is getting someone's life set up to handle, okay, you're a working father, you're an
Mm,
expected tradesman, you're a widowed son or a husband or what have you, you're
mm.
separated, divorced, you've got a FIFO job, you're expected to work night shifts. I've got the amount of that sort of stuff that I've got. And it's like, all right, how can we optimize your life to handle this stuff, and then also have a goal outside of that you want to progress in, that you want to work on for you personally, and not feel guilty about it or ashamed about it, or that you're a lot of the common arguments that I have is that for any man who wants physical development, they're vain or they're arrogant or egotistical. And
Yeah.
talking to them, the problem to me is like they're not. They're very insecure, doubtful, borderline sensitive males that find the degree of, say, bodybuilding or physical development as a means of an expression, as a
Mm.
means of coping, as a means of training and pushing their self or their struggles to the physical sense. And it's just interesting that we have that kind of conversation, if you will, or even just like those issues that's an aspect of men's health that people don't really see, or they just assume that it's fine, it's perfectly okay. But when we get to them, they're actually, it's not about vanity, it's not about egotisticalness, it's not about being arrogant or a dick. There's actually a means of almost an art to what they do, and or
Mm.
what we do, and it's just never looked at that way. Not to get
Mm.
straight into the health side of things, but that it's a sort of parallel here where there is the men's health side and men's mental health and physiology and training and psychology that play such a intricate role, I guess, that it's not really spoken about.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think we're all guilty of not granting men enough emotional depth. Not the same. We don't grant them the same richness of character as we do for women. And often, when we apply that to the gym, we think all these men are vain,
Mhm.
shallow gym buddies. When in fact they're not. They're just as vulnerable as anyone else. And often, I guess their body is a consequence of perhaps deeper insecurities within them. And when we also factor in that men are less likely to talk, perhaps they lack the emotional linguistics of women to an extent. And we got to ask ourselves, what are they not telling us? Like, we know that men aren't speaking to us, so we have to sort of hypothecate on what aren't they telling us.
Mhm.
And often the things they aren't telling us are insecurities or traumatic experiences.
Mhm.
And how does that warp our language and our perspective of men? We see men as ubiquitously privileged, and there are certain privileges to being a man, but there are also missing parts in the conversation that they aren't telling us, missing stories and things that they haven't told us. I mean, I don't want to keep going back to domestic violence, but one of the flaws in the way we collect data is that it's based on police reports.
Mhm.
So when people say 1 in 3 victims is a man, what they're actually saying is that 1 in 3 police reports is a man. And because
Yes.
men are like 2.5 times less likely to tell anyone about
Mhm.
their abuse, and they're also less likely to recognize it at all. We've got to ask ourselves, like I said, what aren't men telling us? What aren't the men in the gym telling us? How do they feel about their bodies? And we have to give them the space to talk about it and encouragement. But we also have to just give them the respect that they are not just a non-playable character in your life. They are a deeply rich and interesting person. And I feel like, I mean, I think I have a lot of compassion for the guys at the gym, because they are stigmatized and stereotyped as just this hyper masculine
Mm.
guy. But I mean, I've the people I've met, like yourself, Ben, I've been such lovely, authentic, sensitive people that just go completely against that archetype. And I think it's not enough to say men can talk, but we also need to give them the space to talk. And and then and then obviously listening to what they've got to
Just
say.
an interesting like something that I think I even said on a couple of your posts maybe is one of the issues that I find when we say men should talk is that we presume communication is simply from the perspective of vocalizing a problem, and that to wrap that back to say training is are men talking, just not in a way that you wish to hear it or in a way that you're prepared to hear it. Do we have men talking in levels of communication? Basic psychological communication was a subject we studied in the first year of my degree. Now they emphasize how to listen without speaking, how to read someone without like seeing what they're saying without them saying it, knowing that they engage in the conversation, or is there something buried beneath it, is there something else going on? All these things, firstly, I'd also like to recognize that there is potential in bodybuilders, trainers, athletes, gym goers. They just love it. We just live and breathe. This is what we do. It's not always oh, he goes to the gym 5 days a week, there must be a mental problem here. But if let's say there is something underneath the skin, underneath the surface, we could say, oh, men aren't going to a therapist and talking, so therefore, there's no data that's not true. There is no proof of their problems. But the amount of men that, perhaps there is something they're doing out of character, different to usual, or they've started a new hobby or got super fixated on something, and or they aren't communicating the way they used to, or they just their new actions are presenting a piece of information that you're not reading, or that you're not seeing, or that you're not listening to. So they are talking. It's just, are you prepared to listen in a way beyond just your ears? Are you saying, not you personally, but people saying that men aren't talking? Are you sort of just blind or ignorant to the fact they are talking in the way that they think they subconsciously might not even be realizing they're doing? By going to the gym and absolutely sending it on their body, or by going full tilt into this new hobby, or locking themselves in the garage for 20 hours a day and working on their car. We have ways of solitude and solidarity that we all in do things, but is there a way that we are talking, you're just not listening? And perspective that what you're used to as communication, or because it's been so perceived that men don't want to talk to a psychologist, therefore they aren't speaking, or they don't deal with their emotions, but we're dealing with it in a way that we know how, or that we think is vocalizing it, or we're just simply doing it and you're not really picking it up. So it's always a sort of principle that I come back to when people say that, after spending subjects on communication as a language, and recognize when people say men don't talk. I'm like, well, you're also identifying that they have these different behaviors, or these different all of a sudden these new hobbies and these midlife crises. That's communication. That's communicating. It's just you're not taking it in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, people at least have to be open to the fact that maybe men are talking, but we're just not great listeners, or we listen to a language that doesn't exist for men, and they choose to communicate in a way that we don't recognize. I mean, there's other areas. I know you've been a great example in terms of exercise, but also we're very open to the fact that men at work, because men have dominated work for so long, that we've built a space that only recognizes achievement from a male point of view in terms of the work environment. But there's also environments where women have dominated, like psychology and psychotherapy, where our approach to our solutions are based more around what I think women need, like talk therapy.
Yes.
Like I work a lot of therapists and psychologists, and they're like, all of our interventions are based around sitting in a room, normally with a woman, and getting them to talk. And I'm like, well, maybe men don't want to talk. Maybe the fact that only 1 in 4 therapists is a man is a problem. Maybe men are talking, but in a language you don't understand. Maybe men need group therapy. Maybe men need physical exercise and that sort of therapy. Maybe I've heard someone say, men don't like face-to-face time. We like side-by-side time. It's not about talking. It's about doing things together. That's why when men don't remember what you said, but they remember what you did, it's because they like the thing you do. Like men like going on walks, men like going on bike rides, men like, going to the gym together. That is therapy for us.
Yes.
Not all men, but often men. I personally subscribe to that. I feel way better going to the gym. That's my therapist. And also not just therapy, but also education is another one that comes to mind, where boys, one of the things people just do not believe me on is that boys being behind in education.
Oh yeah, that blows my mind.
Like the headlines are every single stage in more or less every single Western country, boys are behind, and significantly behind, and have been behind for decades. People just don't believe that. It's interesting because in the developing world, girls are behind. Africa, some parts of the Middle East, girls are of course behind, and you can't talk about education without talking about Afghanistan, what's happening to women there.
100%.
But in the developing world, sorry, in the developed world, America, Europe, and Australia, boys are behind, and it's an interesting paradox. But when we look at why boys are failing or falling behind, people talk about, oh, they misbehave, they're acting up, and I'm like, they're not misbehaving; they're just not behaving like girls.
Yes.
They're not. And if you look at male teachers, for example, 1 in 5 teachers being a man, they're way less likely to problematize boys' behavior because they can see it's not a naughty boy in their classroom. It's a boy that's just not interested or bored or frustrated.
Yes.
And perhaps we should look at the way we teach boys so they do feel engaged, so they don't have to act in these ways that are misperceived as naughty. So whenever I hear that, everyone's like, boys misbehave, boys don't behave. I'm like, no, they're not misbehaving. They're just not behaving like girls because boys aren't girls. We are in general different in terms of how, especially in terms of how we learn, and especially at that time of life where we're all just flooded of testosterone or estrogen or whatever else. And we need to, in the way that we re-examine the work environment to make space for women, and rightly so, we also need to re-examine education, especially in developed countries, and also the psychological industry, both of which are 70 or 80% women. So
Yeah,
I mean, I encourage
if I
both
remember the
sides.
stats, I think if I remember the statistics correctly, 75% of social sciences in Australian or Western campuses are female. And then
Yeah,
that obviously that leads to the fact that of the graduating classes, that would predominantly make 75% of working clinicians or working practitioners
yeah,
in those fields of, say, talk therapy, clinical psychology, things like acceptance and commitment therapies,
yeah,
mindfulness practices, all those sort of like those progressive moved on from your basic sort of psychological undergraduate. That then the logical conclusion then is that the working field now is just dominated by, say, a female, and
yeah,
that isn't wrong. It's not bad. It's just that if I can sort of tell you right now, I've had different interactions when it came to things like my father passing away. I saw a female psychologist, purely because the first interaction with her was free because of like he was on the Australian like medical system, so kind of like the post passing was all kind of like part of the package to get help for the family and whatnot. And she was great. There's nothing wrong with her or anything like that, but when I was discussing about the ways in which I deal with my problems or the way in which I go do things,
yeah,
to her it was like I had to sort of sit there and explain myself. It was sort of like,
yeah,
what do
yeah,
you mean? Like, what do you mean you didn't like sulk or cry or sit? I was like, I had to go back to work. I had to go do shit. I had to go like. She's like,
yeah,
well, how did you process it? I'm like, I processed it. I processed it. It happened. I accepted it. I'm pretty heavily stoic in how I look at philosophy and life.
right,
And from that, I knew that I had to get on with my life and help other people. Like Peterson
yeah,
said, be the man that can. What is it? One of his rules is be the person at the funeral that can help your family. And
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
to me was kind of like, well, that's my role. That's the thing that I have to do is I have to be there for the rest of the people in my family who aren't. And it was just an interesting sort of, the way she sort of looked at it was like, well, hang on, you can't be okay because you haven't sat there and like, broke down. I was like, well, I cried when it happened, but then to me, I'm like, okay, well, now there's no point crying anymore. I've got things that, my life doesn't stop because his does. But, there was also periods where my mother was not that way and she was very heavily distraught. Obviously, understandable. It's completely fair. But you're not going to sit there as a therapist and say, well, they're both the same thing. Like that's just not, it doesn't make sense. But, that is a consequence, obviously, of having purely a female dominated area that is so important. So then telling men to go talk about it is that I didn't have a male therapist in that system that I could access for free. I didn't have one that I could go to be like, hey, let's maybe we go for a walk or train or do something and sort of like use that to open up the boundary to talk. That didn't exist. That wasn't kind of there for me, which again, it wasn't the end of the world, but at the same time, it was just interesting how she sort of viewed it through the lens of, oh, you're supposed to be broken right now. Why aren't you like emoting? I was like, well, I emoted. I've already emoted enough that makes sense to me. Now I'm on to the next thing.
Yeah, like you express yourself in your own way. Like maybe going to the gym and exercising is your means of expression.
Exactly.
You're a perfect example of what I mean in terms of the psychological industry. I don't think it's not intentionally flawed. I don't think there's some sort of like weird conspiracy of women that are trying to exclude men. It's just they are acting in a way that they know, in that way that they express. It's not something intentionally happening. But I know there's research, Australian research actually, ironically speaking, and they asked men, why did you drop out of therapy? Biggest reason, I think bigger than all the other reasons combined, is like I just didn't have a connection with my therapist.
Yep.
Didn't have a connection. And I mean, I'm working directly on research on that, unpublished. So it's like really, really fresh, like new research. And they ask what the barriers for help seeking for men and like 1 in 20 men responded with like shame. I feel ashamed, and that certainly is a problem. But 3 times more men felt a distrust for their therapist, and they had negative experiences of therapy. So although shame, the shame that men experience going to therapy, which is a problem, the problem of not feeling that they can trust the therapist is 3 times bigger.
Yeah.
Not feeling understood. And I feel like we need to look at that more seriously. And with the way in which I feel like it's almost going the wrong way, where inside psychotherapy, there is more and more ideological viewpoints around traditional or toxic masculinity and patriarchy, and these ideological, political, highly political, non-scientific concepts that are now being written into the very guidelines. So the APA, which basically gives all the guidelines for psychologists and therapists in America, they wrote that directly into their latest guidance for treating men and boys. And I just like that. There's no place for that in science. And
Absolutely, yeah. Like,
the other thing I was going to say is that I have learned everything I know about my emotions. All of my emotional language and emotional intelligence I owe to the women in my life. I've learned so much from women, from former girlfriends and friends and stuff like girls. I owe a debt that I will never be able to pay off in terms of how I'm able to talk and express myself. But so too, I think there is some stuff that women can learn from men in terms of how we process emotions. And you mentioned stoicism, and I'm not trying to say men are exclusively associated to stoicism, because I know our mutual friend Brooklyn believes in stoicism too. But I think there is something to learn from men, and stoicism especially, where you don't allow yourself to become affected emotionally by things you can't control.
yes.
So anything out of your control, then you let it go. You don't let it emotionally destabilize you. And I feel like there are really valuable tool sets that men have in how they process emotions, where they're not emotionally stunted. We're not like problematic in that way, but there's certain things that I think women can learn from men. And of course, men can learn from women. And I have learned from women. But I'm a level of stoicism. I think I'm naturally a stoic. And when things go wrong in my life, I'm always the most calm in the room. Like I'm very good at working out what can I control, what can't I control. And things I can't control, I'm like, okay, it's done, it's over. Like if I miss a turning on a motorway, obviously I can't do a U-turn and go back.
Yeah, exactly.
So I let it go. I let it go. I'm like, I missed it. I'm going to be late. It's fine. I'm not going to get there any sooner by panicking. And whilst expressing emotions is helpful, so is processing them. And I feel like men are very good at processing emotions, not always expressing them. And we need to have both tools, expressing and processing.
That is literally like the definition of emotional intelligence regulation, is that you not only have the capability of understanding and processing your emotions, but when necessary, you can display them. But at the same time, and then I guess this is something that when I teach mindset and I teach mindset-based work to clients, to potential clients, to bodybuilders and things like that, is that when we're looking at apatheia, which is what the Stoics refer to as not being emotionally too attached to anything, and then obviously the dichotomy of life, which is looking at what do you have power to change and what you don't. When we look at those two things, they're tools that I generally find most of my clients benefit from across their life. So, whether we're put into aspect in bodybuilding, also I will see it improve their life at training, at their family life, at their jobs, their careers, their education, their study. Getting people to understand that it's not like there's a weird, it's ironic actually to sort of talk about it, is that amongst like psychotherapy and parts of the current sort of psychotherapy realm, there's perceptions of stoicism that it's toxic, that it's emotional stunting, or that it's an emotional dysregulation and things like that. It's almost anti thesis in terms of psychotherapy, but it's like it works in conjunction with, we're looking at how, if we can teach men to understand, or especially when we look at like the dangerously, I guess, emotionally damaged men, the ones who are causing the problems that do need the work, is looking at how we can help regulate their emotions, how we can look at controlling things, not taking it out through just pure rage. Okay, what's the rest of your emotions you're feeling? Okay, well, now you feel them. Do you need to display all of them? Can you control them? Is there something about them you can't control? What do we do about that? Like, instead of simply saying like this is toxic or this is a problem, there are solutions amongst these therapies or these tools that people don't even like, that actually have potential to solve problems or potential to be helpful. And I've found it across my clients when I teach them these things, like they don't realize I'm discussing stoicism with them. I'm just simply saying, like, what is the wisdom of this? What is the virtue of this? Let's look at what your control and uncontrolled list is. Is this something you've got direct control over? Is this something you have passion about? Is this something that you are too heavily invested in emotionally that you hope for an outcome that if you didn't get it would cause a problem? That's like, we're just using this to kind of get to a solution, but it's the principles of stoicism. And it's had a profound effect, I would believe, on 75 to 80% of my clients who weren't already that way inclined. To kind of give that emotional understanding that these men actually do have the capacity for emotional regulation and intelligence. They get to practice these things and put them into use. And I've seen them all benefit from them. I've seen them all improve as people, not just as athletes or bodybuilders or gym goers, generally from these sorts of things where we're teaching them about further emotional regulation, emotional intelligence, and kind of to control it. Well, now they're also improving their love life, their relationships. I'm seeing them build families and businesses, and it's like give men this chance to have the capacity to be emotionally in charge, but also emotionally controlled, and you'll see stronger men get built.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it goes back to not granting the same emotional depth to men, like an angry man, for example. We see an angry man, but often anger is a secondary emotion for something else. Often behind anger is something else, usually fear or insecurity or fear of abandonment or pain. And instead of just saying anger, ask what is making this person angry, mostly men, and try and talk to that person, try and talk to the vulnerable child, I guess, beneath the angry man. And I just think, and also I want to just qualify what I was saying in terms of stoicism. I also don't think stoicism is the be-all answer to everything.
Oh no, absolutely not.
Putting in a metaphorical language, that I live in my own place now. I'm learning the tools of DIY with more greater or lesser success. Let's put it that way. And if I tried to do everything with a hammer, then I'd live in a complete mess. But I buy different tools for different needs. I have like saws and hammers and all this sort of stuff. I've just bought I don't know what it's called, this new drill thing. And I feel like emotional regulation is the same, where we need to have different tools and different tool 100%. Sets for different problems. So sometimes it is best to express a problem. Sometimes it's better to process it. Sometimes it's best to do a bit of both or neither. And we can't fall into the same problem of being like stoicism is the answer to everything. It's just one answer to certain things. And sometimes it's good to actually talk, of course. And I just want to recognize that.
100%. I completely agree that, and this is why, I think, that makes the way I coach quite unique. And I guess even the way I look at data, research, evidence is that we look at it from best practice of application and work back from that. What is optimal and how can we sort of take a step back from there and sort of introduce it or use it as a tool? There's never like this one exercise is the best exercise. This one mental tool is the best mental tool. This acceptance practice is the absolute practice to use and you'll solve everything. The second I see that from someone, instant red flag. If I see a coach or a therapist or a psychologist or a doctor, like this is the way, I'm like, well, you're already wrong. You already don't understand science enough as it is. You don't understand the fact that no science can be absolute. And if you claim absolutism in science, you're automatically wrong.
Yeah. Well, it's not scientific. And that we'll go back we're going back to the scientific model of scientific theory in terms of that. And I always try to remind people that on my blog, where I'm not going to give you a one size fits all solution to every single thing. I mentioned how earlier in on this podcast, how spanking often causes people to become violent later in life. In terms of what spanking is, you're using physical violence to correct someone's misbehavior, which is essentially what domestic abuse is. Like one of the partners trying to correct, quote unquote, someone's misbehavior through violence, and they learn that a lot of the time through childhood. But that doesn't mean that I think every single child who's spanked grows up to become an abuser. And it's really annoying when I say that, because people are like, well, I was badly spanked as a child and I'm a great person. And I'm like, yeah, well, 2/3 of people that smoke heavily don't die from lung cancer. But that doesn't mean smoking isn't bad for you.
Exactly.
I walked across the road earlier without looking. That doesn't mean people don't get hit by cars. We're trying to give you a wide set of tools that you can use in whatever set circumstances. And it's frustrating that people immediately go to their very, very extreme situations to try and disprove what I'm saying, rather than taking every single thing I say as a different perspective and then building that into their tool set of life and then working out themselves which one works best in any given circumstance.
It's interesting how when it comes to the challenge of self identity, anecdote holds such value in the face of actual overwhelming data and populist understandings.
Yeah.
Like when we
Yeah.
look at diverse sample populations and like the realm of training and physiology, like our data pools are rarely as big as what it is in social studies. But when you have like a social study that shows you like cross culturally, cross field, cross realm, this is the normality, this is the bell curve, and you get someone come in and go, oh, but that happened to me and this didn't happen. Like, but in this instance, you're the outlier, you're the exception to the rule.
Yeah.
You can't use that level of thinking to apply to life, because just because you didn't get caught by the cops when you were speeding doesn't mean you won't ever get a speeding. Like, you can't use that premise anywhere else. But for some reason, as soon as your identity is challenged, that's the go-to. Is like, no, but this worked for me, so therefore you're wrong.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about subjects where there's a huge amount of very painful personal stories. In terms of, I keep talking about domestic violence, but there always seems to come up there's always someone in the comments that's sharing a very powerful story of their own experiences, which are very, very important. But your personal experiences, you shouldn't base your entire worldview on your own personal experiences, no matter how painful they are, because we need to look at like broader data in terms of like at the wider trends outside of your personal experiences. And it's difficult because when we look at statistics on that level, they become deeply depersonalized. And I believe as human, I mean, we talking about Dunbar's number now, where how many people can you have in your life that you can meaningfully understand and help? And I think like 150 is the number of people for a human being that we can meaningfully connect to before they become a faceless statistic.
Yeah.
And you start. I mean, I don't want to get into the habit of quoting Stalin, but he said, "One death's a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." And I think there's truth to that, where we look at a pie chart or a spreadsheet of millions and millions of people, and regardless of how compelling the data, we don't see it in the same way as we would see someone who sits down next to us and has a cup of tea and tells us about painful experience. And like one of those experiences, either the personal story and human testimony has way more resonance with us, as it should, because we are actually human beings. We're not pie charts and spreadsheets ourselves. So, I mean, that's going back to what my strategy in terms of how I communicate, where I do want to include broad national data from huge surveys, but I also want to include personal experiences too, because both of them have their own sense of resonance. And it's difficult. You need both sides, and that's that's why feminism is so successful, because it made the personal political, and it encouraged women to share stories. And that's why I think men talking is important, because that gives us the kicking off point to do further research into what they're talking about. Like how are we ever going to investigate these issues if men aren't even telling us what they are?
Exactly. So, and it's important, I think, to understand, like when we look at social studies and social sciences and social data, that which we at a certain point you simply have to understand things. You have to understand populations, you have to understand demographics, you have to understand, in order to solve a problem, you have to understand it. And this is cross nutrition, physiology, psychology, social sciences, epidemiology, biochemistry, whatever it is. In order to provide a solution, you have to first understand that it's a problem to begin with, or there is a problem there, or there's potentially a question there, and then find or compel the data that shows that is an outcome or a problem. Here's a solution to fix it, or make a change, or adjust or program. Where though it is we're looking at numbers here, and this is again the similar premise that we look at when we talk about we get the same sort of response when people who say, like, look, this is the basics of obesity and how you lose weight. Instantly you get the population sample that comes in and is like, well, my thyroid's this. You're like, okay, you're 1 in the 1 million. That is a normality under the bell curve. You're the outlier to the extreme. There's not to dismiss your story, but at the same time, like, we can't use you as a basis for everyone, because that isn't a normal functioning thyroid. That isn't a normal functioning person. We need to coach for the normal person and work outwardly from that. We're bringing, we're using the data so that we can humanize a potentially dehumanized concept or idea. Like, especially if we look at mental health and physical health, and we look at men's health, like, in a certain degree, we have dehumanized the conversation. And so when we're simply looking at the data and trying to bring a conversation to the surface, we're trying to bring a sense of humanity back to these people, that, hey, their problems are just as real, and that there is potentially, problems here or issues here. Let's look at the data. And then it becomes hard because you're like, well, the data says that you're wrong. I'm not saying that you personally are wrong, your experience is wrong, but the data is showing that potentially your personal opinion isn't the norm or the regular, and we need to establish that. And obviously that would, that entire premise creates an issue, or creates especially if you have any sort of empathy or degree of communication where you care or compassionate, as you said, because you're kind of like, we get to a point where it's like, look, your problem isn't neglected, it's not negligent, it's not insignificant, but it's not everyone, and we have to talk not just to you but to everyone. And I mean, I can only imagine the mental toll. I've seen you take breaks from social medias. I've seen you say, like, Tinmen's going away for a bit, because like I just, in the way I coach people, I can see how that across 44,000 followers would be overwhelmingly draining to have to explain yourself all the time, or touch on points, or, well, sorry, I didn't include this demographic. Like, it would get exhausting.
Yeah, it's as well. I mean, we touched on a point, a very negative part of social media and human. I mean, we're all the hero of our own story. We're all the main character, and we should be. But often on social media, people are very self-centered, and if something doesn't relate to them personally, they throw the whole thing out.
Yeah.
And we also try to go to the most extreme and visible examples of stuff. Like, I don't know, I seem to be infatuated about talking about domestic violence on this podcast, but whenever I talk about male victims of abuse, so there's always someone that comes in and says, well, women are killed more often, and that is true, but that is also true. That is a very, very extreme form of domestic violence. If you look at the millions and millions of Americans that experience domestic abuse every year, not that the very, like, 0. whatever percent of them are killed. And it's frustrating that we are drawn to these highly visible, dramatic instances, rather than looking at the almost mundane nature of some of these issues. And I mean, also, I keep coming back to this scientific theory, scientific method of, like, we talked about that earlier, about how you present an idea in science, and then you try your very, very best to falsify it.
And to disprove,
so you come up with a hypothesis, and then you attack the idea. And if you lift it up, and if the scientific community can't destroy your idea within a certain amount of time, you can reasonably expect there's an element of truth to it. And you and I, Ben, both live in areas where, in talking spaces where that doesn't exist. Like, we have a theory, and then we don't subject it to the same level of scrutiny, because they're so often tied to our personal identities. We don't look at them as dispassionately and externally. And I just really wish we would. I really wish we would look at things in a way that is scientific, and expose them to that scientific model of rigorous disapproval, because that's how science exists. That's how science has moved forward for hundreds of years, where we come up with a theory, we expose it to scrutiny, it's falsified or it's proven accurate, and we move on. And that I wish I saw that in nutrition as well, rather than people becoming so emotionally attached to their own personal ideas and their own personal experiences, and take a step back, as difficult as it is, and try to look at it from an impartial point of view as much as possible. And the same is true for so many things I talk about in terms of domestic violence, and the way we see domestic violence is 60 years old now. And we need to have a new set of ideas, and we need to scrutinize the old ones. And otherwise, there's no moving forward.
One of the things, again, cross of these two realms or fields in which we both exist, is that the idea of challenging the old way is wrong, or perhaps it's grounded in bigotry or hate, or some sort of phobic issue, when any other realm of science, if you go back to chemistry, you go to philosophy, you go to physics, there is, like, we're still to this day trying to disprove things like Einstein's theory of relativity. We're still trying to, okay, waves of dark matter, how do we understand this? What does string theory say about that? We're literally in those realms of thousands of years of science, we're still trying to say, hey, you know what, this person was wrong, or potentially this way we did it back then is out of date. We can actually do things better. How do we split the atom to make a different type of bomb that will create nuclear power or fission? We're creating different techniques from the old data, because, hey, actually, look, this person missed this in the equation. But in these sort of polarizing mainstream or captivated sort of realms, it's almost like a morally wrong position to say, hey, potentially that person wasn't on the right track, or they had the idea, but they've missed a few data points or key variables to the equation that make a big difference. If we include men here in this level of analysis, perhaps the data isn't quite as accurate as you think. Or if we include this demographic of men into the discussion, all of a sudden there is a variation in abuse or violence or suicide or death. Insane thing. If we include this population into the data pool when it comes to low carb diets, or when it comes to averaging out the high thyroid or low thyroid, suddenly we're seeing, hey, you know what, the way you did it previously was wrong, or the way you were doing it isn't quite correct. And now we have a whole different set of number points or data points that we can actually study. The second you do that, like if we look at there was a 3-person team that started writing the data on, I can't remember. I think it was one of the first key points that talked about men being equal recipients of violence in interpersonal relationships, and they were literally chased out of town.
Oh yeah.
To the point that they were threatened, like bombs were threatened to their houses. They had their doctorates redacted. They had their careers completely destroyed. They had to go in isolation. All because it's, hey, actually, you know what? This model we've used for assessing violence may be a little bit flawed, and here's a new way to do it. And they're just like, nah, no way, that can't happen. Like, at a certain point, like, these people are simply trying to make society better. We're all simply trying to improve society. Like, even if we go back to the Stoic reference, that like the wisdom and virtue in trying to bring society forward through our field of knowledge or education or what we study, it's something grounded in virtue and morality and righteousness, I guess, if you want to be really philosophical about it. But because it's challenged your old way of thinking, it's instantly like it's met with an attack, or it's met with a degree of violence or hatred, or this just simply can't be allowed. We have to throw this out, baby with the bath, get rid of it. And I find it so. Well, it got to a point, like, to not even be on your level. We ran a men's health group for a while, and the level of argument and discussion that I got into with people when I was trying to say why I was doing it, I had to stop because it was taking away. It was making me angry. I was making me frustrated. I was exhausted. I was drained. I was struggling to do my actual job. I was struggling to do my studies at school because I was just so dilapidated from this level of conversation. And it saddened me to a degree because I was trying to help these men, and I was trying to help these fathers. I was trying to help these people, like, create a space where it was just us, just for us. And all of a sudden I was some sort of like hate-filled misogynist pig, this, that, and the other, all because I was like, you know what? Men are actually suffering from separation of their children, losing their loved ones, or losing being taken away from their kids, having to work 30 hours a day in a 24-hour day just to try and make some money to pay back what they owe, or pay off a debt, or, pay child custody so they can see their kid. All these things where I'm like, that to me got exhausting. It got to a point where I was like, I need to pick what battles I'm fighting here, because it's becoming so draining. I was getting so worked up by it. And so well, like I said at the very start, people started coming after my job, and started coming to like the personal places where I was working. I was like, I can't do this.
Wow.
Like, I generally can't do this sort of level of engagement purely for trying to say, hey, I want these dads to be healthy too.
Yeah, well, that's a lot. That sounds like some very tough experiences for you. I'm sorry that happened. I have not had that same level of pushback. I've not had anyone come to my work. But I mean, I wish them well if they did. In terms of men's health, we've got into this idea of like this swinging pendulum of men and women, where because women were disadvantaged in health, using your example, historically speaking, pre-1965 in America, we seem to think that continues to this day, and we've now swung the pendulum in the other direction, where the facts in America, for example, is if you take 10, the top 10 causes of death for Americans right now, men lead in 9 of them, and men die in America at 1.4 times the rate as women. So men's health is in a serious disrepair in America. And then we've got to talk about suicide, the greatest threat to a man's life in my age, your age, any age below 50 in America. And these are these serious issues. And when we look at what is the government doing to solve it, very little is the answer. Like we have America has 4 different offices for women's health that are government-funded research organizations looking into disease and diet requirements and various different issues that affect women's health. 4 of them, none of them for men, not a single one. And I think we need to get out of this idea that society is built just for men, and actually look at the fact that if it is built for men, why is there not a single office for men's health? And there's loads of different areas. I mean, you chose health, but in the UK where I live, there's a minister for women, a minister for women's health, and a newly appointed ambassador for women's health, all three governmental positions dedicated to supporting women, women's health in particular. And I'm totally on board with that. Excellent. I'd make it 10, but I just wish we had the same for men. Like the numbers I've looked at, I mean, I don't recommend reading it because it's depressing, but every single death in the UK is put into a spreadsheet. And I once worked out how many more men die below the age of 65 than women. And the excess is 20,000 men 20,000 more men die in the UK below the age of 65. 20,000. And I worked it out as a jumbo jet full of men exploding every single week. And there was no minister for men. There was no minister for men's health. There's no ambassador for men's health. And there's no discussion to appoint any of those roles. So when I hear about a structure built for men, I'm like, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Because if it were, there would be a minister for men. And I just wish we were able to look at the objective reality in front of us and sent to a point move past the past where women were discriminated against and suppressed, and not fall into a system where we've swung the pendulum in the opposite direction. Another example is education, which we talked about already. In the early 1970s, women in America were 13 percentage points behind men in higher education. So women were being discriminated against, women are out of education, especially at university. And now, 50 years later, men are behind, and men are more behind now than women were 50 years ago.
Yes.
And there was no plan to correct that. Similarly to the Office for Men's Health, we have the Coalition for Women and Girls in Education, which is purely set aside for getting women and girls into education. And it's a great organization, and I wish them well. But there is no similar organization for men, despite men falling millions and millions of fewer men going to university every year in America. And I was like, well, where is the equality there? Where is the consistency of compassion and views? And why are we so willing to overlook what is happening to boys and men in education and men in health, purely based on the historical context? Because if anything, it's good news. The fact that we've managed to bring more women into education over the course of 50 years, so much so that they've now swung straight past the men, is a sign of success. And now we need to do something similar to address the disparity.
The irony that always gets me when we sort of look at denying the evidence, right? So I think, I can't remember where I put the post, whether it was one of your posts or a Facebook page engagement back when I was really trying to discuss these sorts of topics, and it was always met with some sort of argumentative response, was like, we can systemize and we can sort of map out, if we look more at a global lifespan of, say, a young man and systematically young men's lives over a period of time, we can get enough of them, we can start to systemize and start to see sort of trends and patterns and responses. Now, let's say like we're trying to solve things like violence. If we look at education, we're saying, like, look, you know, if you want to talk about the topic of solving these violence problems, which apparently is what we want to do, we want to talk about how to improve men around, you know, violent behavior and violent responses. And that's absolutely great. 100%. You know, if we can cut down on violence, fantastic. That's always a good thing. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, let's look at something here. You're denying men the accessibility to be up to date in education and to be at the foremost, I guess, productivity of education and benefit from education and be educated, be intellectually developed. Because with that then comes the potential that they now have an increased capability of earning capacity and an increased response of mating pairs. They have a better health likely outcome of family life. They have a chance of raising a better family. So they're creating an environment in which the men you were talking about that are at risk of being violent are no longer susceptible to the drugs and alcohol that lead to the violence, or they're less likely to be involved in the areas that are established or connected with violence. The testosterone, I got really aggravated by, and it was something less stoic of me, by James Cameron's comment that we need to remove testosterone because it's toxic and dangerous. The testosterone, that when we understand it, when in the right environments and sort of stimulated in the right environments, things like, you know, productive competitiveness, protection, provision, defense, even things like education, the the testosterone response is actually shown to be pro-social behavior, it's pro-social status, it's pro-social developing. So testosterone itself, in and of itself, can be constructive and productive. It's not testosterone that's making us bad. You take that education. Now you've educated these young men in how to be better and how to be productive and constructive and involved in society. Now they're creating other men around them who are doing the same thing. Now they're sort of in fields or realms of study or education or production, or even in things like industry and construction, where they're working on upskilling, they're providing more services, they're providing better services, they have high degrees of income. We know that with high degrees of income, there is less associated with violence, drug use, drug addiction, alcoholism, lower IQ, more high risk job fields like death industries. All of that suddenly diminishes. So now you don't have an angry, isolated, violent, emotionally damaged or exhausted man who's at the end of his wits, who's simply looking to find a way to deal with his pain, which is probably going to be something violent. Just the fact that we've increased access to education, which we can see clinically. So, I'm no doubt someone will probably see this and come across one day and say that that's not true. Okay, we can see in the data when we look at it, as we've spoken about, when we're bringing data points to a dehumanized issue, we are trying to humanize it. We're trying to make it acceptable and understood. The education is the data is quite clear on where we lack in men's education, to the degree of secondary school and then to college and then to post-tertiary education is very, very low. We're insane. Like, let's build these things up alongside women and let's build these things up together. We're actually solving the problems or improving or decreasing the risk of the problems of things like violence, homelessness, drug addiction, alcohol abuse, because the risk factors that contribute to those are found in education. They're found in whether or not someone is educated and developed and intellectually stimulated, because in that sense of, okay, now they have an education, they have greater earning capacity, greater job employment potential. They have different realms they can work in. So now there's a need for what they have to offer. They have unique skill sets that, as a supply and demand economy, works. Now they have money, they're earning, they're doing things, they're contributing. They have a constructive family, a positive environment for other men to learn from, or young men, or the kids. And it's just interesting to me, like, I guess to go loop around that absolute ramble, that in the essence of people wanting to not have these discussions and not have these unpolarized camps where we're simply looking in the middle ground. I like to refer to myself politically as a centrist. I never believe that someone has to be absolute left or right or middle or top, or complete communist to complete socialist. Like, I don't believe those things have to be capitalist. Like, they don't have to be that way. There's benefits to things that we can look at, and I like to think that politically, across most things, I have that centrist, unemotionally attached view to a lot of things, whether it be training, nutrition, philosophy, politics, data. If we take that approach in that conversation and we remove the emotion and actually just look at it with logic, in the very argument that you are hating on or trying to deny, which is, women need to be more educated than men, and we need to get more women into the campuses and the schools. Let's take away from men's scholarships and men's degrees and whatnot. You're literally creating the environment in which the problem that you are arguing against is going to fester and rise. We're simply saying, hey, let's encourage this because it actually reduces that problem. Like, to me, it blows my mind that we're even at that point of conversation where it's such a paradox, or if not a negative feedback loop, that because we don't want to have those conversations, we don't want to talk together, we don't want to remove the emotion and the arguing and just the absolute, you never see a irrational sort of hard-wing leftist want to talk about it. It's always like a very aggressive and confrontational and defensive. If we met with that conversation, there'd be so many answers here that we could talk about. And it blows my mind that when we actually look at the data, if you stop looking at things in isolation, we expand out and look at it globally, there's almost like a map out of how to get to that solution. But the second you bring it up, it's met with just, retort and violence and aggression and hatred or dislike or disagreement. It's like, what the answer is there. We're trying to help you get to the answer. We want the answer, but you're denying it.
There's so many good points there. Lots of it I agree with totally. I consider myself left-leaning centrist too. Like, I like it. Well, it's like when you go to a sweet shop and you're doing a pick and mix. You don't just want fizzy cola bottles, and you don't just want those gummy eggs. Exactly. You want a bit of everything. And I try to separate my emotions from my political viewpoints and my identity as much as possible. That allows me to pick the best of both sides. Because unfortunately, there's a lot of good work being done by conservatives in the area that I'm in, and I find it quite alienating because I'm not conservative at all. I'm very like I said, left-leaning centrist, and I just wish there was more acknowledgement of what's happening to men and boys within progressive left spaces, and also there's more more willingness for people to go back into the center. And what the phenomenon you're describing, I quoted Stalin, and I'm going to quote Maggie Thatcher, with neither people alike, but she said, if you walk down the middle of the road, you get hit by both sides. And that's so true and hilarious. And it's like, if you show a centrist point of view, you get picked apart by everybody. And it's like, that's where we should all be. And like I said, I just wish we would see it that way. I know a lot of people talk about men and boys issues, mental health and stuff in the perspective that you said, and it's always been something I've been apprehensive about, where everyone seems to frame what's happening to men and boys as a benefit, the solution to what's happening to men and boys as a benefit to women. Like, do you not want healthy husbands and fathers and sons? And if we all equations have to be addressed by both sides, but instead of seeing it as a solution to women, I really encourage people to talk about men's issues as in their own right, rather than as a benefit to women primarily. I mean, of course they are. There's secondary benefits to everyone, but the primary objective for me is treating the issues primarily to benefit the men themselves, rather than a benefit to society. But it is true. I mean, putting it to an example, like we see men, for example, men who have fantasies of violence, we often see them as problematic, and perhaps they are, and we see them as toxic and violent and whatever else you want to ascribe to them. But there was a great study last year from the University of Cambridge that looked at the experiences of men with violent fantasies, and it looked at bullying in particular, and it found that 97% of boys who are the most bullied in school developed violent fantasies later in life. And they hypothesized that violent fantasies are a coping mechanism to deal with violence. So if you're being bullied as a boy or girl, it's slightly less than for girls, I think it was like 80% for girls, but especially for boys, if you've been marinated in violence in school, you develop violent fantasies as a means of dealing with violence to come. And once you start to talk about violent fantasies in that way, suddenly you have a little bit of compassion for these men and boys who probably have experienced violence in childhood. And what is if it's basically validating what you said, in the sense that if we can solve bullying in school, we are also solving, to an extent, violence later in life and violent fantasies, which are enacted on women too. And you also mentioned testosterone. I mean, there's lots to be said about testosterone. I mean, Jermaine Greer called it a poison. Like, thanks, Jermaine. But there's just a lot of highly political so-called research within testosterone. But I mean, I've just finished reading T by Carol Hooven, and Carol Hooven's the co-director of biological evolution at Harvard. So you'd be hard pressed to find someone more qualified to talk
on it,
the T. And she talks about there's too many people talking about testosterone from a political standpoint and not taking evidence-based perspective. And whilst testosterone is correlated with someone being more aggressive, having higher sex drive, and how often men have more testosterone than women, almost always, there also has positive benefits to testosterone. And she talks a lot about the Carnegie Awards, which have been existed for about 110 years. The Carnegie Award is given to someone who risks or even loses their life to save a complete stranger. And she found that basically every year, maybe 100 are given out. I think there's been 10,000 awards given out, actually. And she found that over a century, 90% of those awards have gone to men. And she said that men are also more likely to perform heroic acts to save strangers, not like their children, but like a random person in the street. So although men are the ones that are setting the fires, they are also the ones that are kicking down the door to haul you out of the building. And we need to acknowledge both sides of that and acknowledge the positive benefits of masculinity, rather than pathologizing masculinity as something that's inherently wrong inside of people. We need to also acknowledge that it has done huge amounts of good. And I just think we need to look at the evidence for that. And
well, I mean, you can look at. So one of the like a big passion of mine was like World War II. I love military history. It's just like there's arguments for my almost spectrum behaviors, because I get really heavily fixated on some things. I get really dedicated to a topic for a period of time, and I was just obsessed with it. And I've been obsessed with World War II for, the better part of, I'd say 15, 20 years. It was just something I just started getting interested in. One of my, I presented a thesis in year 11 high school in regards to World War II. I can't remember exactly what it was on, but it was something completely out of nowhere. And I was just in love with the idea of learning about what we can take from history. And one of the things that we don't really acknowledge is one of the first data points is that 99% of all deaths in military history has been male.
Yeah,
that's just a straight up fact. I mean, we can look at Hillary Clinton, who said women are the biggest sufferer of war, which just blows my mind. You can say that, even remotely acknowledge that data point with that conclusion. But in regards to how we're discussing testosterone as a positive influence, the way in which that they provoked enlistment to things like the draft, or sorry, not in the draft, enlisting to get soldiers at first in World War II, England, America, Australia, all did the same thing, was evoking a sense of honor and courage and valor, that we are, like, find that national spirit, defend the people who can't fight for themselves, go fight the monster abroad, because, this is your call to adventure. You're Frodo going on an adventure, you're Bilbo Baggins going with Gandalf, like, this is your call to arms to save the people around you. And we got to a point where there was literally, I think one of the biggest records is something like 6 or 7 times an underage soldier was reported for trying to enlist in the army for his sense of duty and honor and courage, that, they took away, they tried to deny him because he applied like 6 or 7 times underage to get in, because there was this sense of honor and dignity and respect that, I'm going to go do my duty and I'm going to go fight these people and I'm going to go prevent the bad guy from winning. In the same token, where you're saying that this hormone is bad and people with this are toxic and we have issues, it's literally also the thing that is making these competitive men, these driven, masculine, dominating men, power-hungry men, want to go also use that dominant competitive power to fight the bad guy, to fight the villain, to defend you, to be at odds with evil, do all these things. And Peterson refers to it quite a lot in his philosophy and the way he discusses men with purpose. That, like, it blows my mind that we can have this research available, or just reflection, or past data. If we look at Band of Brothers, I'm watching Band of Brothers again at the moment for like the 20th time, and each time I pick it up and I watch it, especially from like my psychology lens, I'm watching the way in which these men who rushed off to defend each other and defend their country and fight together, they're also going through, and it's acted quite well. Like, the actors amongst it, they're pretty big name actors, and it's quite well produced and shown. They show things like their shell shock, their PTSD, their undiagnosed PTSD, their trauma wounds, their coping strategies, the way they cling to their sense of honor, and the guy next to them, all these things that we're fighting for the ones back home. Like, it's drilled in every single time you watch an episode. There's something about it where these blokes went there for the guy next to him in the hole, the guy next to him on the line, but also the ones back home. They're also the bad guys, and we've got to stop the Nazis and the Germans and all that jazz. And it can all be positively associated to testosterone, to raising good men. I mean, we shouldn't be raising good men to be cannon fodder, but we're raised like, when raised well and they have these morals and these virtues, they're the very productive people that we're trying to create and say, hey, let's stop these violent behaviors or these tendencies. That same thing that you're saying we should get rid of, which is, testosterone and masculinity, is the very thing that has led to you having the freedom of the West. Like, it's the two can't be mutually exclusive. It just that it's necessarily existing. And it's just an interesting thing, the way in which we can publicly demonize such concepts of men, and then also benefit so heavily from them across history.
Well, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I think a big problem is gamma bias. If you've heard of this, gamma bias is basically how in the areas of sort of suffering and goodness, we erase the male gender, but in areas of privilege and perpetration, we highlight the male gender.
Yes.
Called gamma bias. I mean, I invite anyone to go and give it a Google. It's very interesting. Martin Seeger's done a lot of writing into it. And the way you can experiment with gamma bias in your day-to-day life is if you just look at the news. If a man does something bad, does something violent, look at how much his gender is highlighted. You get like toxic masculinity, male violence, patriarchy, this and whatever that. But when a man does something good, his gender is erased. So like you have like gunman, knife man, henchman, con man, 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 man. But when a man intervenes to fight the knife man, which it
Bystander
almost
does,
always is,
stranger does.
bystander,
Yeah.
stranger, vigilante, good Samaritan. I'm like, well, they're also men.
Yeah. Yeah.
The big, there's all men. And like 9/11 is another good example. I mean, not good. I mean, it's an effective example in the sense that all the hijackers were men. I think maybe a dozen of them were men. That became a big part of the discussion. But then also, every single firefighter who lost his life was a man. I
Yes.
think 244 firefighters lost their life
Mhm.
because they ran into the building and they died. 100%, not 99, but all of them.
Yes.
And it's a shame we only seem to talk about the bad that men do rather than ever gender the good. And then if you tell people that, oh, men went to war, but then immediately someone will say, well, men started the wars, and
Yeah.
which is only partly true because women also start wars. Maggie Thatcher, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also a lot of. I mean, it's actually been studies on that where women, female monarchs in Europe were more likely to go to war than
Yes.
male monarchs. But the problem is that who's doing it men, who starts the wars men, who writes the laws men. The problem is the mindset there is flawed already because you're seeing men as some sort of monolithic gender where we're all the same and we're not all the same. We're different. There's good men and there's bad men. And the good men are fighting the bad men, but because we're looped into some sort of monolith, we're sort of deprived of any sort of compassion or respect as men. And it's the same whenever you talk about men who are victims of violent crime, which is substantial, the same thing again. Like who's doing it? Who's doing it? Men. I know it's men, but
It
like
doesn't matter. It
what?
doesn't matter.
Like, I don't know. What does the crime not count?
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't realize it doesn't hurt if the person beating me up is also a man. What? And if the first thing you reach for is pointing at the genitals of the person doing the assault, if that's the first thing you point, then you're not an advocate at all. You're just interested in blaming people.
Yeah. That's just pointless
And
thing.
I as a victim of violent crime, I shouldn't be deprived of support or compassion because I have the same gender as a person who did it. I don't I don't understand how that makes any sort of sense. And it makes sense because we live in a society that has created this male oppressor class where men are just one thing, and that is often bad. And if a man commits a crime, then it's people almost seem to think that it's a man committing a crime against himself. And again, that goes back to us not wanting to grant the same sense of individuality and emotional depth to men as we do for women, and we just lump them all together. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. What else? What else do you say?
I can ramble. Don't worry.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're an expert at it, but in a good way. But yeah, no, gamma bites is very interesting. So yeah, I just think going away and looking at the news and asking yourself, why do we only seem to gender the bad? Another example would be when Sarah Everard was killed. A woman called Sarah Everard was killed in London, like one of the most horrific crimes you could think of, by a male police officer. And what followed over the next weeks and months was huge amount of campaigning against male violence, which is understandable. But during that time, the following week, I think, a woman tried to kill herself by jumping into the Thames, and some random man didn't know her, jumped in after her, tried to save her, and he died, and she survived. And no one ever gendered his act of heroism. Whilst the conversation was going on about male violence, and understandably so, no one ever talked about male heroism.
Mhm.
And we erased his gender and we highlighted the gender of the man who killed Sarah Everard. And another good example of
Do
gamma
you think
bias, I think.
that comes from a kind of like to really touch on a really good point here? I think. Do you think that comes from almost an expected? So we talk about like a patriarchal structure where they view that it's dominated by men, and we have this power. Do you think that language change, that different, sorry, that different of language around who's responsible and who's not responsible, or who's the hero but who's not the hero? Do you think that has something to do with the fact that when we look at across history and we look at the biopsychological evolution of the species, that it almost comes as a sense of expectation that we're willing to, almost like an actor observer bias, we're willing to deny the the heroism because it's a sense of expectation. It's expected that we do those things. It's expected that you're the serviceman, that you are the provider or the protector or the provisioner, the builder and the constructor. Like, we don't need to acknowledge that because it's expected you do it. It's part of the socially ingrained, presumptions or expectations. But then if you do something that we can make attention to, then all of a sudden, well, that's not okay. That shouldn't be okay. We need to talk about the fact that you're a man. We need to talk about that, because it's such a I find when it comes to the services that we're expected to do, the risking of the lives, the building the high rises, the construction, the sewerage, the bricklaying, the being cannon fodder, being shot at in the wars, these are things that it takes degrees of heroism. I've worked on construction sites. My old man was scaffolding the sky rise. It is not an easy feat to get up and build those buildings that you're safely resting in. But, it's kind of like a sense of, well, that's just what you should be doing. So why are we bringing acknowledgement to that? Though we don't recognize the fact that each person every single day that does those things is risking their life for that very thing.
Yeah, I mean, rings of the whole bare minimum thing I consistently hear. The bare minimum, men are doing the bare minimum. Or you'll see conversations online about what would you do in a world without men? And the conversations are almost entirely about how safe everyone feels and how much better life would be. But I'm like, what about sewage, or what about electricity or water?
How do you think
like
these
what
things
about
run?
What do you think? Who do you think is scrabbling around underground, fixing the infrastructure that we all rely on? And why are we so reluctant to acknowledge that is mostly men, and it comes at a huge cost? Workplace deaths are almost exclusively paid by men in America. It's something like 4,500 men killed every year, which is more than the entire Iraq war in terms of military losses. Mm-hmm. So more men are killed at work than all the US soldiers from all of the entire Iraq war over 20 years. And that is a huge thing. I think it's
thing. 9 out of 11 here in Australia, and that's considering we are a very unionized country with a lot of EBAs, contractual agreements.
I think it's 92% in the US. In fact, 91%. And again, I know I mentioned the Office for Women's Health, but there was also a Women's Bureau that is all about building safe, supportive work environments for women. But there's no Men's Bureau. Mm-hmm. So I get another great example of structural advantages for women that don't exist for men, which is totally antithetical to what we're continually told, where society is built for the needs of men. And I think people confuse the fact that because society was built by men, people seem to think that it was built for men. And if you look at the lack of things like the Men's Bureau or the Commission for Education of Women and Girls, or the Office for Women's Health, I don't see how that's built for men, because it seems to be built for women. I mean, society's built for men and women in different ways. I also want to bring up, I know we talked a lot about military deaths, but we have that conversation about also acknowledging that the number of veterans who die by suicide greatly outnumbers out any amount of military deaths. I think it's something like 7,000 American soldiers have been killed in in warfare since 2001, but 30,000 have died from suicide. Mm-hmm. So 3 times more veterans die by suicide than had died in the actual war. So the real war is at home, when you come home, and then also not just suicide, but homelessness, drug addiction, trauma. These men are just, they go out, they risk their lives, they lose their lives, they lose their limbs and their livelihood and their mental health and their friends. They come back and they're treated it's literally like homeless people, not as heroes. And they're left to basically end their lives by suicide or fall into addiction, which is not really any different. And I just think that's the hidden side of the pain that men pay to fight the wars that win us the very freedom that you and I are enjoying right now. And it's annoying it's not annoying, but we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma and epigenetics. I mean, the example that comes to mind is within Black communities in America, how the intergenerational trauma of slavery across families in America, Black families. And I was like, that's very interesting. I'd love to know more about epigenetics and how how our trauma can become part of our genetic makeup and how that's passed down intergenerationally. But no one seems to be willing to talk about the intergenerational trauma of the tens of millions of men who have died in war in probably one of the worst ways possible. Dying in a war is one of the worst ways to go. And no one talks about what is the intergenerational trauma of the men of generations to come as a result of like my granddad being in the war, his dad's in the war, and like what does that mean for men? Like why can we not apply that same mindset to men?
I mean, I like a couple of points to touch on there in looking at gene expression through stress and genetic epigenetics, as you're talking about. I think my father's stepfather, or both his stepfather and his direct father, both served in World War II, and I had to have a really hard conversation with, I think it was my mother or my uncle, because I never really had the knowledge I have now to sit down and talk with my dad about it at the time. And he's a very hard knocks kind of guy where, it was like grunt and cuss, go to work every day. Put it this way, like hearing the word proud means a lot to me, because it meant it was never really said unless it was significant at the time. I had to sort of get into their heads and get them to understand that, there was a big push in there was a big response in the post-war lifestyle because of things like alcoholism, drug abuse, violence, abuse, and that sort of 1950s era America. And there's a lot of negative connotation around it, and rightfully so. That I'm not justifying the actions. What I'm getting at is that no one sat down, because psychology was such a new realm by the early 1900s, even into the first sort of third of the 1900s, that psychology was so new, we didn't really have the understandings nowadays that we do on clinical therapies and expressions, and understanding psychological trauma and distress that comes from being exposed to such traumatic experiences. These men were coming back to, well, firstly, jobs that were either gone, or economies that were completely changed, expectations of them to just simply return to normal life. The draft is over, the conscriptions are over. Like, let's be very clear that the draft was male drafted, and the conscription was male conscription. Mostly of fighting age and their fighting health. So you're coming back at a 20-year-old man who served at, let's say, D-Day, and you survived the march across Europe, and you've gone back to America. That you have seen some things that no home life experience can fix or correct. You can't make up for that. You can't improve that. You can't correct it at the time that those treatments existed and those situations occurred. You simply just don't have the ability to recorrect what you just went through. There's only something that can be seen. If you watch Band of Brothers, again, an example, there's a scene in which they find one of the death camps. You can't unteach that to someone. You can't unexperience that and then go, well, now you've just got to be a functioning human again. You've just watched the worst of human history and human behavior, and you've experienced and interacted with it.
Yeah.
And the likelihood is, if you were part of the companies that were there, you were male, because that's what it was.
Yeah.
You've now got to go home to life, and you're seeing like thunder, lightning, or you're seeing flashes, you're seeing 4th of July fireworks, you're seeing, someone who looks like a German potentially, you're seeing someone who looks like one of the European countries that you fought in, or, there's a bang suddenly. Like, you can't unexperience those things and have those developed traumas and experiences psychologically. It wires certain things in your brain. You have a heightened amygdala, you have a heightened hippocampus, you're having a heightened responses neurologically and like psychologically to the situations that cause these triggers or responses. That's what we're seeing in PTSD. But you're just expected to come home and act normally, as if that's some sort of like normality to experience and just return from and go, well, that's over now, turn that switch. There's going to be certain expressions and neurological adaptations that occur to deal with these problems, coping mechanisms, strategies, psychological repressions, emotional neglection. There's going to be a list of these things that you just simply can't deny and say, well, just get over it. Like, these men were, these were bad men when they came back and they're abusive and violent. Like, hang on, they literally just went through absolute violence. There is no way to, like, you can't mutually exclude what happened in the depths of the Battle of the Bulge, or they're at Bastogne, deep in these situations, even the Eastern Front, whatever it is you want to talk about. You can't deny these situations and then also say, hey, violent men, because they went over there to not be violent. They went over there to stop violence and protect and serve, and they came back destroyed. And you can't mutually exclude those two things psychologically, that the violence they may be showing or displaying, or the alcoholism, the drug addiction, they can't put into words what they saw. And so now the means for them to express that is through this behavior that they've used to deal with it. Like, smoking became heavily dependent over there because it was a way to calm the nerves and ease off anxiety. Alcohol, when it was available and it was found, like all these things that now they've brought back home, That's now behaviors they've got to deal with the shit they just went through. And most of the average age of the D-Day landing was 21. So you got guys coming back from D-Day at 24, and the rest of their life they have to live as if they're normal. You can't take that out of the equation in the conversation as to why they might be fucked up and what, the things they then passed on. Like when I talked, like to kind of get to that point I was talking about, when I talked about my father, and when I talked to him about some of the things, I talked to mum about it, because I don't think any of that's off books. I'm always happy to talk about it. Is that the level of love and respect and emotion that he showed to me was tenfold what he got from his father.
Yeah.
Because he came back from the war in these positions that were just absolutely messed up. So to him, he was showing emotion. To me, I was like, this dude said, "I'm proud of you," like 5 times, and I can count each one of those and remember each one of them to the T. Like, to me, I was like, that pushed me to be better. I was like, well, how can I be better? Because, when he says it means something. It's got gravitas to it. That was him emoting. He was displaying pride and being proud of what I did. He never got that from his dad. So to him, he's like, this is tenfold different to, what happened. So he's emotionally improved and mentally improved, he thinks, from what he went through. But, if we go by the current expectations that men have to be perfect in emotion and we have to be completely on point with our emotional regulation and these expectations, you go literally, that's 2 generations. That's literally 2 generations back between my father and his father, that he potentially came back from his experience of the war in a messed up position. There is no way you can't say the other 7, 9, 10 million people involved in what was it? No, 40 million people involved in World War II. 99% of them were male. You can't say they all didn't have that same sort of experience coming home. There's got to be something said there that there's a consequence of this experience now affecting how they raise their families or they live in society. And then inversely from that, obviously the family they have after that.
War is definitely a big example of that. But I guess it's as a wider practice, I hope we can all agree that the vast majority of people are not born bad. I mean, I'm sure there's psychopaths and stuff like that, but the vast majority of people are not born bad, but there are bad people. So, yes. And some of those are men. A lot of them are men. But we should ask ourselves, so what's happened between someone not being born bad and then displaying negative behaviors? Like, how do we fill in the gaps of that journey? What has that person experienced? It might be war, but it might be anything. It might be trauma. It might be abuse in childhood. It might be bullying. It could be anything. And until we start to fill in that journey in a way that doesn't blame men for being men, then I don't think we'll see the progress we need. And yeah, I think war is certainly a thing that would be traumatic in a way that I just cannot even fathom. But it doesn't have to be war; it could be anything. I remember seeing listening to a really annoying podcast where a couple of women were talking about the fact that they wanted to have a memorial for the women that were lost in the war in America, which is fair enough, sure. But the memorial, people were like, you can, but it can't be taller than the men's one. And then on the podcast, they were whining about it. They were like, they're so fragile and this and that. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but I'm totally on board. Like, no, yes. You do not get to have a bigger memorial than the men, considering this huge disparity. And I'm not apologizing for that. No, it has to be smaller. Like it has to be representative of the sacrifice that men and women made. And I'm not saying make it tiny or don't have one at all. I'm saying, but it just simply can't be bigger.
It's got to be scaled. It has to be relative.
Yeah, the wider problem is that we just don't gender. Going back to gamma bias, we don't gender the pain that men feel. We don't and especially in like political issues. I'd say the biggest 2 political sort of world-changing events from the last few years are probably George Floyd. Everyone talks about how it is an issue faced by Black Americans, which is absolutely true. But so too is it true that it's Black men that are experiencing police brutality. If you line up all the Black people killed in 2020 alongside George Floyd, literally 99% of them or more were Black men.
Yes.
And it was an absolute tragedy that we never gendered it as a gender and racial issue that overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, affects Black men. So we were so reluctant to gender it as a gendered issue and a racial issue. And I guess the other big political event was Qatar, the World Cup. Everyone talked about all the migrant workers that were killed, but no one said they were all men, and they were all men. 6,000 men, migrant workers, killed to build those stadiums. And I worked it out where if we had a minute silence for every male immigrant worker killed to build the stadiums, we would have gone for the first 70 consecutive games without having a single word said. And no one made that a male issue. Again, another thing in Qatar was obviously gay rights, very important, but no one ever talks about how gay men are historically and still today, they're singled out. Not gay women, gay men are the ones that are persecuted. If you look at like the going back to the war and gay people were killed by the Nazis, it wasn't gay people, it was specifically gay men.
Yes.
And it wasn't gay women. Lesbians were not condoned by any means, but they weren't rounded up and killed in the tens of thousands. So by erasing gender from these important social issues, we create the idea that men have had it great for all of history. And then some of them have, but not all of them. And you see it the most in minority men, black men, and gay men, and immigrant worker men. And this is a great example, I think.
I just to kind of touch back right there on that point in the reflection when people remove the gender, I guess, around history. There's this weird assumption that we men have been the single benefactory of the ease of history, if you will, and that we created a way in which we've benefited the entire time. But again, it's looking at like psychology, and I guess like, you know, this is stuff that some of the more of the stuff that I get to study that is beyond just my nutrition and training, is that when we look at evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, up until in a certain recent period of time, it has been a mutual dichotomy of benefit that society has been built on, that you know, these so-called roles that were created by us and these social constructs and these social existences and blah blah blah, subjective reality, postmodernism and all that jazz. Let's go back before that, the 100,000 years in which our species has existed and evolved and got to a certain point in time where now we have this level of conscious thought. Up until only recently, it has been very widely understood and accepted that there is a mutual benefit and almost an unsigned agreement that comes with the I guess the abilities and the skills and the strengths and the weaknesses that both sides of this species have. And that is that, you know, when it comes to let's say nurturing, when it comes to you know, being in the house and making sure that the children are raised, and again, this is very traditional, I'm not saying it has to be this way now, but if we go back through that, yes, sure, there was an expectation on the woman to be in those roles, and that's what you have to do. But that doesn't immediately mean that all of a sudden men had it easy because, like, hey, you're raising the child. Back then, that it grew inside of you. It still does now. You know, you needed to be around to feed it because we didn't have the levels of industriousness we have now to provide services and foods and like you know, automatic things that we can have now to make living easier, modern pleasures. So it was kind of like someone does need to keep an eye on this child, but also, if one of us is going to go forage or hunt or raid or pillage in order to feed and have provisions, it's probably not going to be you as the female bearing the child. It should probably be me. So I'll go risk my life to find the food we need or the provisions or the resources or the necessary goods that we have. I'll risk my life in the war to earn my, you know, if you're a Roman citizen, if you're a Roman auxiliary, 25 years you had to fight in the Roman army before you gained Roman citizenship to even have a house or to have like a level of land. Now, that's 25 years as a soldier. You have to continually fight. And we know Roman history was a lot of fighting. So I'm going to go do that in order for us to have a life here. So, you know, whilst you're at home protected and eating, I'm going to go off and exchange that value that you have here. I'm going to go and exchange that over here to make sure we keep getting that. It's weirdly neglected. You know, when we look even you know, around things like construction and building like these great monuments that we have and all these things through history, it's weirdly left out of the conversation that, you know, whilst yes, there was, I guess, I didn't want to say a degree of control. There was a mutual expectation that the female raised the children or stayed home and you know, took care of the house, or you know, perhaps they were a slave maiden or something like that, and it was a bit more that way. That the very people that were, you know, the builders of these great amphitheaters and colosseums and pyramids and all these very unique constructs that took a lot of work and risks and deaths and people falling off things before, you know, we had scaffolding and workplace health and safety. They were blokes doing that. Like, there were men that were doing those things. Like, there wasn't this strange like 10,000 year period where it was just simply men sat under the fans and got fed grapes and got to like live this lavish lifestyle. There
Yeah.
had to be the men in the armies and the men in the construction forces and the slave camps and the mercenary huts that were doing these works that, you know, that required a degree of sacrifice. It wasn't just simply like, oh, well, I was born with a penis, I get to be the recipient of all this luxury. I've got to go risk my part of the equation, which is in order for the species to survive, I need to achieve resources, and I need to go do things and build things and construct things. You probably should stay home and look after the child so it's fed and safe and warm and nurtured, because I have a lot more testosterone, you have a lot more estrogen. That's going to be what naturally happens. And yeah, it's strange to me that we neglect that part of the conversation. It's just a weird assumption that history is a male paradise, when some of the most gruesome points in life, you just go back through the way people were killed or fought in wars, or sent to die, or things like that. Like the way like 7 years old, a Spartan soldier was taught to 6 years old, a Spartan was taught to start fighting. Like that male in Sparta does not get a choice to live any other lifestyle. They don't have they don't have freedom.
And there's no choice for men either. We talk and understandably. I mean, ultimately, for the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of human history, it's been shit for both male men and women. Like, it's been awful. Like, it's people always seem to descend into who had it worse, when the fact is we all had it bad. And the dividing line between who had it good and who didn't have it good isn't gender but class. And both women and men are on both sides of that divide. Like, it's about the working class versus the upper class. That's the haves and have-nots. And you're right in the sense we don't gender historical suffering. Like, we look at the slaves that build the railroads, or the Great Wall of China, and you should ask yourself, like, what gender are the bodies that are buried beneath the Great Wall of China, or who was blown up whilst building the Hoover Dam, or what corpses littered the railways? And it's men, working class men. And of course, women have had their own historical struggles too, where women were having 7 children. Up into the 1800s, 50% of children would die before their 5th birthday. So it'd be like a flip of a coin whether your child would survive to their 5th birthday. Women had to raise those children. They had to educate those children. They had to cook and clean for those children. 7 kids. And she had no choice. She couldn't opt out of that, but neither could her husband, who was stuck down a mine somewhere or going to work. Did he have a choice? No, I'm not going to go to the mine. Yes, you are going to go to the mine. And both lives were awful. And what liberated women from that lifestyle, as you said, a lot of it was domestic sort of tools, white goods. That meant I didn't have to cook things from scratch every single time. They had fridges and microwaves and ovens.
So they got ovens and cooktops.
And like, no one wants to talk about how the greatest liberated women were those things, plus the pill, which gave them reproductive control. And guess who created those? It was probably capitalism, the old patriarchy. Like these are products of capitalism that have liberated women. And we need to have a similar liberation of men from their sort of gender roles now, as we continue to liberate women from theirs. I suppose put it into like a hypothetical situation. Like, I feel like if people went back 500 years or 200 years or 1,000 years and got to choose whether to live the life of a man or a woman, I genuinely think it'd be a difficult decision to make. I would be one you'd have to think about a lot, and it'd be crap probably for both sides. And I at no point want to try and wave away the difficulties that women have historically spent and the pain they've gone through, but neither do I want to wave away what men went through. And the fact is that we're all privileged now. The fact that we live in the tiny percentage of people that get to have we are all privileged just by being born today in developed countries. And it's a shame that we don't acknowledge that.
I think just on what you've touched there, it's something I've said 100 times. Like, when in the safety and security of peace and privilege, it's hard to look beyond the fact that times have had it worse than we have. And all of a sudden, when it's all over the news and all you see is the news that this is wrong and this is wrong and this is happening and death here, if we look at it statistically, there has never been a safer point in time to exist in human history other than right now. and it's only getting better. Yes, we see things that get worse on the news, or this is happening in global warming, this catastrophe. But you got to realize you have such access to information now that it's not possible to not see it. Somewhere, someone somehow is sharing it, interacting with it, engaging with it, whatever. So these notions are just an absolute struggle to exist now. One of the times when I and this is a very extreme example, when I deal with clients psychologically who discuss hunger or starvation, one of the examples I give them is the Battle of Leningrad. And I'm like, look, if you could choose between existing right now on choosing to have a diet and wanting to lose some weight, and us working to get you shredded to go to the bodybuilding stage or the competition we have going on, or just getting lean, if you had the choice between choosing to be hungry right now on the food that we're sort of working through, or the dietary intake of the Battle of Leningrad, I can promise you right now that they're experiencing is starvation. Yours is a choice of hunger. We've got to look back with perspective and go, okay, and that's a very extreme example, but it's a way in which we can understand perspective and position, because with the right perspective, we can look back in times and go, oh, fuck, actually, you know what? I've got it pretty good right now. My perception now is I'm making this choice to be, a very, I guess, relative example is when my clients choose to cut, one of the things I say when we go on a bodybuilding stage, it is a privilege to choose to diet. It is a privilege to be over-consuming calories, to build muscle, to be in a surplus of food. It is a privilege. At a point in time in history, being fat was a display of power because no one had food. So if you had food and wealth resources, you were fed, you had money. Now, it is a choice that you wish to be hungry. 1,000 years ago, 200, 500 years ago, it wasn't sometimes, most of the time, it wasn't a choice. It wasn't a privilege to be able to say, I want to be hungry for a period of time to get lean, or I want to overconsume to build muscle mass. Because history is so messed up. When we look at that perspective, we take that perception, we can look back in points in time. Like I said, Leningrad, we can look at that and go, okay, you know what? They had 800 calories of a mixture of sawdust, bread dough, and feces, human fecal matter. That was how they constructed some of the food they used to survive the Battle of Leningrad in World War II.
Yeah.
At a certain point, cannibalism broke out amongst the city. That is how bad it got in terms of available calories. Now, that is not a choice. They weren't choosing that. They weren't, hey, I want to sit in this point in time and exist here and sort of make that choice. We now exist in a relatively safe environment where I can say, for the next 6 months or the next 3 months, I'm going to restrict my calories and choose to be hungry so I can get healthier and leaner. I can make that choice. I can safely make that choice.
Yeah.
And just that, take that perspective. That's a very, unique example, but take that premise and apply it to anything. I think if you're taking anything away from this conversation, is that use critical thinking and perspective to take that back and go, you know what? I've got it pretty good. I've got a situation, it's relatively not that bad. I am not at odds with, most things. If the biggest struggle I have is how long I'm hungry for, or how long I'm, in the gym for, training my ass off, those are all luxuries we get to experience today that 200 years ago you would have been shot for. So, just it's a degree of let's have perception, let's have compassion, let's have empathy, and also let's have that perspective shift that it's not that bad. Right now, we're probably creating our own enemies just because we're so safe. We're so secure in what we have going on that we're creating the problem.
There's another book I've been reading called Factfulness by Professor Hans Rosling, and he talks about that. He says we don't notice the gradual improvement of the world, how we live in a healthier, happier, freer, more educated world than ever before in human history. And that slow march of human progress is kind of boring because it happens so slowly. Whereas we're bombarded by the news by these horrific, highly visible, singular events. But we can't ignore the fact that we do live in a better world than ever, and we should all be grateful, both men and women. I know in terms of Leningrad, it reminded me of something I read recently. I think it was Richard Reeves said, probably the worst gender or time to be born in history was a Russian man.
Yes.
At the beginning of the 20th century.
Yes.
Because only one in 3 of them died.
1 in 3.
Right before
1 in 3 men at the age of 25 survived World War II.
Shit. Okay. Well, and the Russian men, the experience. I didn't know the details that you shared, but that's horrifying. So to be born in Russia as a man in the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, is awful. And as you said, starving. But now we get to opt into doing fasts. We can choose not to eat. That is such a privilege.
Yeah.
It's almost and the fact that more people die from obesity than from starvation is it's a sign of some sort of success, where we're living in a world where there's so much abundance of food, not always. And that's an important thing that Hans Rosling says in his book. He's like, we can't neglect the world is also still bad, but it is getting better. It is possible for something to be bad
Yes.
and getting better simultaneously. And it is. There are
The
certainly
amount
some
of
things in
bad
the
is
world that are
decreasing.
bad. And we shouldn't take our foot off the gas in terms of wanting to demand continual improvement. We should continue along this path and expect more. But we also need to acknowledge that it is getting better, and not to live a life of just fear and pessimism and chaos. And I don't want to live in that life. Like he compares in his book to so that's 7 million, 70 million or something, like 99.99999% of planes go on their journey and land safely. And no one writes about them in the news, but when one plane crashes and blows up, and that's everywhere. And we live our lives continually in the brace position, expecting things to blow up around us.
Yeah.
So we live in a world where we're only exposed to the very, very worst things that happen. And someone else described it as unexploded bombs don't make the news. And I think there's a lot to learn about that, and a lot of gratitude to be taken from that perspective. And
Absolutely.
while simultaneously still asking for more. I think we should always be asking for more.
Yeah, I think this is something that I preach even from a coaching perspective. So one of the big things, like I'm studied in acceptance and commitment therapies. I've studied anxiety and depression commitment therapies. I'm studying right now in clinical behavioral psychology. The thing that I often prescribe to my clients, and it comes from a big part of it comes from my own personal sort of philosophical beliefs, but things like reading books like therapists like Viktor Frankl, so The Man's Search for Meaning, and the way he wrote about his time in the Auschwitz death camps and things like that. And the boy who went to Auschwitz, like reading from these sort of doctors and these he was a psychiatrist who went into Auschwitz. You get to a certain point where you can accept that things are bad. You can accept that things are the way they are and still want to progress them. You can still want to get better. You can still, a big thing is that I'll push for a client is, we may not, things might be hard now, or, things are the way they are. You've gone through some struggles or some problems. Like, we can't deny that, but don't fixate on that. Don't create your identity around that. Don't create your narrative and story on this problem or this thought or this previously associated disorder or problem or, exposure experience. Instead, we acknowledge that it exists. We notice that it's a problem. We notice these feelings, these emotions attached to it. We accept that it's real and that it's existed. But where I sort of, I guess, differ from the common sort of talk therapy is that we're not going to sit here and hang around. How do we progress past it? How do we improve your life beyond what it is? Because if each person is day to day living a better life, then we are by consensus all progressing forward and being better people and building a better society. Because if each person is working to do better and be better, then logically the only conclusion is that we are all being better. Whether it's 1%, 10%, 200%, whether it's you're down in the ditches and you're absolute POS of a human and you're simply trying to be less of a shit human, whether it's you're trying to change the way education is taught or change the way research is written or change the way we look at health and like psychology or the pinnacle of human performance. If everyone is seeking to do something better in their own life, they're looking more of a local scale, then we zoom that out globally, everyone is doing better things. And therefore the only conclusion then is that society is better. It is the only, when I look at and that to me is my reflection of Stoicism in the sense of wisdom and virtue coming together. We are using the wisdom of recognizing that if I am better individually and I encourage others to do better or be better or just simply, live by an example that I can come out of these problems and I not be absolutely identified with my trauma or exposure to these situations, and I can progress and be better from it, then surely other people can look to me and sort of think the same thing. And, it doesn't have to be the virtuous attacks of anyone that doesn't view the way that the world I do, which is, that very woke cultural sort of phenomenon we have at the moment. Just simply look at the fact that something sucks, something happened to you, it was shit, there was a terrible thing happened or it keeps happening. Great, let's acknowledge that. Now from there, do we stay here and identify with this forever? Because that's a pretty shit existence. How do we get past that and keep getting better? How do we progress despite the fact this happened?
Amen. The past can make you better or it can make you bitter, and it's up to us to choose which one of those paths we want to go down. And you can be defined by your pain, or you can use your pain as a way of becoming a better, stronger person, more resilient person. And I guess we get into the concept of recreational victimhood is a concept. I love that. Such a great use of words. And there's a lot of people that indulge in it to the point where they don't know anything else. And especially when you start tying in like different groups of people. But I mean that's a great, I guess, a concluding statement in terms of you decide what happens next. Like we can't change the past, and it's important that our past isn't forgotten and becomes a formative part of who we are. But we can either process that in a negative way, or we can process it in a positive way. And by allowing each other to speak and share about those things, that we encourage those painful experiences to be positive. I mean, I think the painful experiences of my past, I hope, have become formative, positive parts of who I am now. And
agreed.
I just think I wish more people would do that rather than living in the past and perpetuating that and making it part of who they are through recreational victimhood. Which is why it annoys me when people think I'm engaging in victim sort of like oppression Olympics, where I consider myself extremely privileged. I consider myself extremely lucky. And I really don't want to become embroiled in this victimhood contest. At the same time, we do need to talk about what's happening. Absolutely. And we just shouldn't be defined by it, basically. Don't be defined entirely by what's happened to you. And use it as a place to be better, including who you talk to. Like, I talk to some awful people. I get exposed to some really shit people, and I use them as an example of what not to be.
Yep.
And I wish more people would do that.
Challenge, like, again, it comes to the premise of critical thinking and being able to think for yourself. Is that if you take anything away from this podcast from me, is that I want you to challenge yourself, your beliefs, your perspectives and opinions that is potentially wrong. Apply the scientific method. Potentially what you think may be wrong. Don't just create, and this is something we wrote in my ebook, Creating Optimal Environment, is we're looking to create echo chambers that reinforce what we already know. Because if we surround ourselves by people who only know what we know and only know what we do, and what we think, you can't get better or be improved or learn or develop. Because everything we know about knowledge, about neurological development or neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, everything we know about muscle development, everything is revolved around stress. Exposure to stress or a stimuli, stress being the sense of this sense, a stimuli, the more we expose ourselves to that stress, the greater the stimuli, the greater the load placed on the muscle, the neurological pathway. It has to adapt and get better to handle the progression of the load. So if you're only creating environments in which you exist that perpetuate what you already know, or reinforce what you already know, or back what you already say, you're not going to be any better. You're not going to do anything more with yourself. You're not going to learn anything new, build a new muscle group, learn a new diet strategy. You're just not going to do it. So, put yourself in positions where you're made to think or challenge, which is, I can almost guarantee there'll be a percentage of people that come onto this episode and disagree or, what's this got to do with nutrition or training? No, it doesn't. It's got more to do with thinking critically, understanding health and understanding the diversity of health, understanding the psychology of health. There's a myriad or a tirade of issues that have come to the forefront when we look at health as a holistic perspective. It is not just, this person has it easy, so they're healthy. This whole conversation is showing you how important critical thinking and looking at empathy and compassion is so important. Whether you're a coach working with people, whether you're someone who's never looked at men's health as an aspect before, who's never looked at testosterone as being productive, has never looked at, the anchors that men may have in your life, now you may have that thought process. Take that critical thinking and apply it.
Well, I'd say 90% of the stuff we talked about has been relevant to health, in the sense that we're exploring the sort of political and structural causes of men's mental health, be that war or homelessness or addiction or domestic violence. Like these are the causes of men's mental health. If you dig into what these men have gone through, like domestic violence and mental health are intrinsically linked, because being a survivor of abuse has a massive impact on your mental health. I mean, and I guess to make that relevant to what you talked about in terms of not building spaces defined by victimhood, I'll end by just talking again by Erin Pitsey, who, like I said, set up the first refuge in the world. So she pioneered refuges for women. And from the very beginning, she wanted men in a refuge too. Men, so because they were squats, as I mentioned, she would have worksmen come in to repair, build spaces, do DIY. And these were good, wholesome, positive men. and she believed that was essential to these women becoming re-socialized. And she was like, how could any of these women change the way they see men if they've been marinated in male violence their entire lives? How could we ever change that unless we can expose them to the good of men? So she felt by bringing men into the refuge in a safe way, of course, and having them build the spaces and spend time with the women, that was an essential part of re-socializing women. But now men can't work in refuges at all. There isn't a single man working in any refuge, not only just in a refuge, but in any of the charities. And I wonder whether by creating this inward-facing male-free space, as understandable as that may be, I don't know whether how useful that is long-term in terms of re-socializing these damaged, traumatized women to the goodness of men. And you can extrapolate that same concept out to all of our lives, where we always avoid the things that hurt us.
Yes.
And is that good? And if we are to overcome that, what kind of bravery and encouragement does that require? And can we give that to each other? I guess that's something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty profound way to, I guess, finish a very lengthy conversation. There's not much more to add to that. I mean, like, is safety and comfort how you want to spend the rest of your life? If that only embodies what you already know and what you already think and creates just an echo chamber of reinforced beliefs. If change is required in any sense of progression and development across life, which we know that it is, you have to open yourself up to tough conversations, tough engagements, tough thoughts, critical thinking. And that's really what you can probably take away from this, is that where you're encouraged to do that, because safety and security is not where you grow. It's not where you develop or learn or improve or get better.
Like you said, like no pain, no gain, to put it back into your
it's all into your court. Gym and training.
Yeah. Made it relevant in the end. There it is. Done.
to finish off, I guess, where can people find you? What is the plan for Tinmen going forward? The immediacy, and what can we look for in the coming future?
I people keep asking me to get onto YouTube and TikTok and whatever else, but I'm just on Instagram at the minute. I'm just trying to perfect that. So I'm on Instagram and only Instagram, and it's at the Tinmen, one word, the Tinmen. So yeah, give me a follow, come have a chat. Feel free to disagree. If you think what I'm saying is stupid, then come to my page and I'll try to have a positive conversation in the community. Oftentimes people do come and disagree, and their comment doesn't get deleted, it gets pinned to the top. And I try to have a productive conversation, even of those that disagree with me, as long as it's done in good faith, preferably about insults. So yeah, I'm the Tinmen on Instagram, and looking forward to seeing you there.
Well, mate, I appreciate your time very much. I know that it is a privilege to have you on and have the ability to converse with you in this manner.
Likewise.
Yeah, it is a privilege of mine to be able to speak to you. I know that there's a very limited number of people that you engage with, I guess, from a social sense, I guess, outside of following Instagram. So to have this opportunity, I guess, to be able to talk with you is a privilege I do not undervalue, if you will.
Well, thank you. I'm always uncomfortable around compliments, but I'll try to accept those ones. I mean, you are OG in the sense that you've been following me since I don't know, years.
Yeah, it's been
years now.
It's been a fair while. I think that I've been around Tinmen even back before we started. I think we started our attempt at a men's health group. So that would have been 3-4 years, I think.
Okay. Yeah, well, and I guess I use this opportunity to thank you as well, then Ben, and it's also been a privilege, and thank you for following from the very beginning. And it doesn't go unnoticed.
You'll no doubt see a few more stirring comments from me that.
Oh yeah,
if you ever notice on the Matter page, there's a comment. It's just because I've definitely seen something from. I'll always try and speak from a psychological perspective, especially if someone's coming aggressively or to challenge a point. Is that I'll try and evoke a point of conversation, or kind of use evidence and research to get to where they've come from. But you'll never see me attack someone directly or attack them personally. But you'll always see a comment from me that will either just completely destroy an idea or an ideology, or propose a question in a way that makes them think, that challenges their belief. Because I love seeing it when I can get someone to land on a point where they challenge their belief and there's nothing left to say. It's almost like the entire the argument falls apart, because they haven't actually thought that deep about the point they've created. So I'll always try and evoke a conversation that way, where someone's made to either stop and think, or just go, actually, I haven't thought about this at all.
The comments are the best part of my page. I think the greatest compliment I've ever been paid on my page was someone said, "Holy shit! Every comment on this page is an essay." And it was just like, they are like, you go on other people's pages and it's just like clappy emoji in the comments, and that's it.
Yeah.
We're like, yeah, you go. But on I'm very proud of my page that there's this huge walls of text that people
Yes.
are having frank discussions, and there's arguments, but at least they're in depth, and
Yes.
you're certainly one of them in the comments, and I look forward to more of them.
But that is it from me, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again for your time, mate. I appreciate it sincerely, and I look forward to the many more conversations that we no doubt have. Like you said, guys, if you have a desire to learn more, ask more, think differently, go find the Tinmen on Instagram, follow along, and definitely give him some engagement. If you have any other questions to me around anything we've talked about, please reach out. Don't hesitate. Challenge any of us if you think it's wrong. Give me a reason. Discuss it openly. Be willing to have the conversation, and I will engage back with you. But that is all from us, and I will chat to you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.